There we go. Today we'll be discussing the novel as a whole. I'm Jennifer Rose with the Eudora Welty House and Garden. I'm filling in for Jessica today. I'm honored to say our discussions will be moderated by Eudora Welty's friend and biographer, Dr. Suzanne Marrs. To comment or ask a question, please click the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and select raise a hand. Be sure to keep an eye on the chat as well. Suzanne, where would you like to begin today's discussion of The Optimist Daughter?
All right, well, I should note, I think, Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Jessica is working on the Welty garden with horticultural experts from Mississippi State. So
correct. She and Lauren are up at Mississippi State looking at the little camellia babies and other things.
Yeah, so that's a nice thought of them up there looking at camellias. I thought, let me say, I have my agenda, but before we get into my agenda, let's see if anyone has anything they want to discuss from previous sessions that we didn't devote enough time to. Does anyone want to raise any issues from previous sessions? Beverly.
I just want a clarification on exactly what Becky dies of. Is this the same condition that Chestina had with the eye problems caused by stroke?
Yes, Chestina and Becky had eye problems first and then strokes. And so it does say late in the novel, it's just one line, but that when we find, I think it's on, it's late in part 3. After a stroke had crippled her further, she had come to believe, without being able to see her room, see a face, to verify anything by seeing, that she had been taken somewhere that was neither home nor up home, that she was left among strangers. So a stroke and eyesight problems and consequent dementia. I now know, I think that's called vascular dementia, but so. Okay, any other questions from a previous? So you do have to be paying attention. Right there. Any other questions from previous sessions? Well, I thought we might start by talking about this question. Does place matter in this story? Does it matter that we begin in New Orleans and that we move to Mount Salus, Mississippi? Would it matter if it were Buffalo, New York, or Cleveland, Ohio, or Wichita Falls, Texas, or Wichita, Kansas? Does it matter that it's New Orleans? And does it matter that it is a relatively small town in Mississippi? For the purposes of the novel, for the novel's structure, its thematic development. What do you think? I know Reynolds Price said he thinks that New Orleans really is not crucial to the story, that they need to be outsiders, the judge and Faye and Laurel, but it's not crucial that it's New Orleans. I wonder what you think. Anyone want to talk about New Orleans in the novel? I've hit on something of burning interest, it's clear, right? I think I see that John has a comment. Yeah, there it is. Good.
I tell you what, first of all, I do think that place matters, and I don't think of it as, and as far as New Orleans is concerned, tell you what it made me think of, a very different part of New Orleans that she talked about in No Place for You, My Love. And which I think is a fascinating short story. And maybe that's just neither here nor there here, but it's in that story, there's entirely different part of Louisiana and New Orleans in that story than we get here. But I do think, in part, the place creates conflict. The place of New Orleans creates conflict between Faye and Laurel. I think so there's that aspect to it. There's something about, her father going out of town from Mississippi to New Orleans, it makes her get up and leave Chicago immediately. And I think that the places, to me, one of the most prominent places of the book is West Virginia. And you
Oh,
just,
yeah. Thank you, John. We should talk about that too. Yeah.
so, and in terms of, does it, yeah, so I think all those places matter, both Louisiana, New Orleans in particular, not the place that is added to New Orleans in that short story I mentioned, but
Well, no place for you, my love, begins in Galatoire's restaurant and moves to Land's End, south of New Orleans. Yeah.
And then does it matter that it's in a small town? I think very much, because I spent part of my life in a small town in Mississippi that was, I think, is maybe as large or larger than Mount Silas was at the time, than Clinton, Mississippi was at the time. And it is, everybody knows everybody's business, or they think they do, in a small town. And I think we get a lot of sense of that in this story.
All right. So you're suggesting that New Orleans is important, West Virginia is important, and Mount Silas all important. Joe Ellen.
Excuse me. I was just going to note that I think that the river and the bridge in particular are important in New Orleans. That the river gets linked to other rivers, but it kind of points up Laurel's blindness to the bridge. She assumes the river beneath it, and all of this sets up the later recognition of the confluence, another bridge that she sees. And I think it gets linked there. I also think in relation to Faye that it's without the Mardi Gras, without the carnival, without the green eardrop earrings, wanting to get out in it, we would see much less of her. We're told that even after the judge dies, I think, is when she says it's like the loss of her whole life. We see what her expectations have been in terms of getting out into the world and what she feels is lost now. And I think that a number of aspects about New Orleans, at least I can't imagine losing it.
So the Faye's focus on sensory experience, on living in now, on seizing this moment, kind of the indulgence that is personified with Mardi Gras and we associate with Faye maybe. And then the whole question of vision from the hotel room, not being able really to see things clearly. Yeah. Okay, what else? Anything else? So what about this whole business of the changes that are coming to Mount Silas? That the cemetery is now right where the interstate highway is, that there is now a car wash, an automatic car wash, that they're telling stories of facing down Klansmen, of being heroic in the face of racism in Mississippi. Are those things important to you in the novel? That social context? Yeah, Beverly?
I think they are, because just like any city in Mississippi or any southern town, but especially a small town, as we went through civil rights era, and things were changed and attitudes were changed. I think we see that, past, standing up to the Klan. Even the fact that Faye is an outsider coming in and marrying an old-time Mount Silas resident and bringing with her this lack of appreciation for the way things were done, the way things are done in according to Laurel and according to Miss Tennyson and according to Miss Adele and the bridesmaids. And she just, as we say, she just doesn't know how to behave. And that is not unusual when you have an evolution from one type of society to another. Faye's out of her league, but she's not quiet about it. She's dismissive, because the life that she has known is different, and she doesn't appreciate what the old folks are hanging on to, including the old part of the cemetery where Judge McKelvey's wife is buried, where Becky is, and she's getting him out of there into the new part.
So the old social order is in some ways under threat, is breaking up. And in some ways that may be a good thing. And in other ways, there's going to be something lost here. And memory in the face of that becomes more important, I think. Rita and then Harriet, and then I'll promise to change subjects. Yeah.
Well, I sort of saw the changes in place in the cemetery and as progress. I mean, and this whole book, one of the themes seems to be, you can't stop life, you can't stop progress. I think that's kind of what maybe the last speaker was saying a little bit, like things go on, life goes on. And the river being a metaphor for that, the Mississippi, the end of the mighty Mississippi, or New Orleans is the end of the mighty Mississippi, where all these rivers and tributaries feed into it till that final end. I'm here at the beginning of the Mississippi in Minnesota. And so that's kind of what I sort of thought is, it's progress and life goes on. A lot of those kind of, thoughts and metaphors.
All right, progress or change anyway.
Yes, change.
Evolution. Yeah.
Yeah.
Harriet?
Yeah, I'm thinking about where we place Laurel in relationship to these changes and the town and the house and her family. In a sense, Welty gives Laurel the option to be a self that she didn't have, which was, having left home and left it behind. And I think that one of the issues that are there for Laurel is how she feels about herself, looking at Faye as a kind of gargoyle of lack of values that are implied in home or behaviors. But on the other hand, she's somebody who has left and who comes back and feels anxieties about whether the town is accusing her of a kind of selfishness. I'm thinking too about the way in which this is the story of the end of life as a daughter, as the death of a second parent always is. And I'm thinking particular about that moment when Laurel raises her hand against Faye and doesn't bring it down, and how I've seen that before in a story that she wrote after her father died years before in Curtain of Green, where Mrs. Larkin raises the rake, and in fact, there's a rake in that scene too, and doesn't bring it down. But that anger about death and loss, at the same time working it out, Mrs. Larkin creating a Curtain of Green, and Laurel in this return home and sorting through things. So I'm thinking about where we place Laurel and I think about the birds, and my sense again that she says about the bird in the house that it is the path is clear. Why doesn't she just fly out? that there's something
They
about,
haven't got good sense like we do.
well, I'm thinking about the way in which she's going to, that's what's going to happen here. She's going to leave home, metaphorically as well as literally. Yeah.
Well, I think too, what's her job in Chicago? She's designing a theater curtain. The theater is there. The cultural opportunities are there. And leaving, staying at home would be a mistake. I think we probably sense, and that Laurel's moving beyond home is a positive development here. Yeah. Joel Ellen.
I'd just like to add that there's one more place to put in here, a couple actually, Texas and rural Mississippi. And the movement among them is important, especially from Chicago to Mount Salis for Laurel, and then Mount Salis on down to New Orleans. And Welty does a lot with journeys. But if we mapped this, we have Texas, rural Mississippi, the small town, and the cities, New Orleans and Chicago, which many people
And
would
West
see.
Virginia.
That's true, right? I forgot West Virginia. Yeah, that's more the outlier, because I'm thinking that there's a kind of class progression here, but with Texas, rural Mississippi, the small town, and the cities. And Jacob raised a question early on. What does the rest of the South think of Texas? And I mean, I can tell you from my mother's perspective that she didn't really consider Texas part of the South. But so there's a kind of progression there with certain values and behaviors kind of linked to them. And rural Mississippi doesn't come off badly because the Cortlands came from it, and the grandfather comes from it. But anyway, just especially though as links, as points for just different journeys and travels, and West Virginia is especially important there. You're right.
And I think all of these places are complex. None of them is cast in ideal terms. Maybe we should move to talk about Laurel. And I thought we might, since memory is such an important concern in the novel, I thought we might look at several passages where we find what memories are accessible to her at what points of time in the novel. Does that sound okay to everyone? If you don't like it, we'll move away from it. Let's start by at the first, when they're in New Orleans on 889 of the Library of America. And Laurel, it's the end of part one, the first section of part one. And Laurel is thinking about her father, and she thinks, in the lime white glare of New Orleans, waiting for the ambulance without questioning the need for it, he seemed for the first time in her memory, a man admitting to a little uncertainty in his bearings. What about that statement of Laurel's memory of her father? He seemed for the first time in her memory, a man admitting to a little uncertainty in his bearings. How do you respond to that? So this is right at the start. After you finish the novel, do you respond to that statement differently than you did when you read it the first time? What do you think? Rita, what do you think? I'm coming back to Minnesota here.
Well, I have lots of opinions about Judge McKelvey and his relationship with Faye, and the fact that he is an optimist. And in fact, I'd like to ask the group if they feel this way. Because one of the big questions, I know John asked that at the beginning, was why would he marry her? I mean, and that is the conundrum that I kept thinking. He's this upstanding man. He's had this wonderful marriage ahead with Laurel's mother. What would possibly possess a man to marry such an awful person? And the only thing that I could come up with is that because he's an optimist, he thought he could save her. And I feel that and he has saved many members of the community. He was a judge, so he would have been in an opportunity to see and be optimistic as he judged people and sentenced them. And that goodness and fairness comes through during his funeral when everyone turns out the whole town is there for his funeral. So my thinking is that Faye was a failure. He was able to rehabilitate Major Bullock. Major Bullock is of the same ilk that Faye is. In fact, he is the one that invites her relatives to McKelvey's funeral, because he identifies and probably came from the same kind of dysfunctional family that Faye's is. I mean, I don't know that we've discussed that Faye's brother committed suicide. Roscoe, as soon as he was the head of mom declared him head of the family, and he went and turned on all the stove gas and killed himself that way. And then she has that brother DeWitt who won't come out of the house, and he's the only one she identifies with. So she's come from a very difficult place to rehabilitate this. But I think that he thought, well, I'll show her how I can, how I'll be kind to her. I'll bring her breakfast in bed every day. We'll take her out every Sunday and she can eat at that fancy restaurant because Missouri always has Sundays off. And he is showing her kindness and what it's like to have a nice life. And it didn't work. And I keep thinking, and that's that part when you said that when she first saw the first time that there was sort of a shaking of his optimism. And I'm not sure that when he dies in that hospital bed, it's from a stroke. It might be kind of a metaphor for giving up. I mean, it's like, I tried. I mean, because you don't expect someone to die from retinal surgery.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like,
yeah, no.
So anyway, I know long-winded, I got a lot of opinions about this, but I just really wonder about the choosing of her and his being an optimist. And she was not rehabilitated. She was not, there was not even a shred of kindness or insight that she was able to. I know there's maybe that one time where she's,
Well,
but
maybe I could, let me chime in here, Rita. And see anybody else. I don't see him as trying to rehabilitate her, but I do see him as finding in Faye someone who will be easy to please, as his wife at late in life was not easy to please. It was very difficult. And here is a way where he can do something, it's easy. Buy those green shoes, give her the peach satin bedroom. She is easy to please. Also, I think John put in, he's lonely. There's a sexual attraction to Faye. There's that connection. So those are all things. I also want to say, I think Major Bullock is of a different social class than Faye, although he does bring her in because the judge has asked him to do that. Okay, let me shut up and let Harriet and Teresa, and then we'll come back to this passage because I think it ties in with just what Rita's talking about here. Okay, Harriet.
So I'm thinking about from what Rita's saying and from wanting about things that we haven't talked enough about.
Right.
And I think one of them is sex and another one is marriage. And I'm thinking about what Faye's effort to rehabilitate Judge.
Right.
And I'm also thinking about the blue beaded dress that Joellen mentioned last week, and are needing to talk about her Becky's sense that she predicted the betrayal. That Faye is green stiletto heels and peach satin on the bed, and so that's an undercurrent in this relationship that is maybe the whole thing. But it's also I'm also thinking about the treatment of marriage in the book. I'm thinking about Mr. Cheek saying to Laurel, "I don't see nothing wrong with you. Why didn't you ever go and had married somebody?" That the expectation for marriage and evaluating marriage. And I'm thinking that the one bird that we didn't discuss yet at all are the pigeons. And I'm just looking at that passage where young Laurel sees a pair of pigeons sticking their beaks down each other's throats, gagging each other, eating out of each other's craws, swallowing down all over again what had been swallowed before, taking turns. They convinced her that they could not escape each other and that they could not themselves be escaped from. Her mother's pigeons were waiting to pluck each other's tongues out. So I'm thinking about the unhappy couple of pigeons and why it is that Laurel has this memory as she's also about to open up this episode in this late episode in her parents' life, which is less than ideal. But it is also the complexity of marriage. It's also what she doesn't have with Philip, who is arrested in time at that early moment of marriage before it's gotten messy.
All right, Teresa, thank you.
That was good. That was good.
Yeah,
Harriet.
it was, as usual. Huh?
I'm gonna chime in a little bit on Harriet. Harriet, I like your segue into sex. I think that was great. There's the expression, I have a 40, I'm gonna trade it in for 2 20s. The judge married somebody younger. And again, I think easier to please and somebody that was unpredictable and kind of funny, crass, below his class, if you want to get into class, but funny, rude, but again, still funny. In that rudeness, there's still a lot of funniness and unpredictable. So in a way, after going through such sadness, I don't blame him for wanting to go out and shake things up. Of course, there's a cost and he paid for that as well. But I give him credit for shaking things up.
And I want to point out too that
Doesn't go
this
over that
passage,
well, though.
yeah, this passage that I quoted, that Laurel thinks he seemed for the first time in her memory a man admitting to a little uncertainty. It's not the first time in her memory. Later, when she has fuller access to her memories, he's been uncertain with Becky. How should he, what can he do? I'll take you to West Virginia. She knows that's false, and he just has to get up and leave. So there's been that uncertainty before, and Laurel's memory of him hasn't been able to accommodate this. In the same way, I think that she doesn't quite want to think about her father having sex with Faye. That's just something she'd just soon not have to think about. And when she sees that cigarette passing back from mouth to mouth, or when Faye says, he always grinds his teeth when he wakes up, and she has to think about them in bed together. This is not something that's pleasing to her. So her memory in this early section is clearly pretty shut down, I think. Mary.
I think that one of the more pivotal passages that stood out to me as far as marriage and the choices that men make regarding that was when the women were all sitting outside discussing this choice and saying they just weren't able to understand why the judge would have gone for Faye. I think one of them says, I could have found many people better than Faye for him. And then right after that ends, there's this image of cardinals playing with those discs in the trees. And Miss Adele says, oh, it's a game, isn't it? Nothing but a game. And that kind of concludes that scene where they had just been speaking of their, uncertainty with how these men make these choices in these marriages. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that was an interesting, I assumed the cardinals must have been male cardinals, but I don't know. But
they call them cocks. Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought that that was sort of a interesting perspective on, I guess, relationships as a game to men, or as something of kind of chasing after these flashing distractions. I'm not sure, but
Rita.
There is that passage towards the end where it says, then Laurel's father, when he was approaching 70, had married Faye. Both times he chose, he had suffered. She had seen him contain it. He died worn out with both wives. almost as if up to the last, he had still had both of them.
Yeah.
So I think that marriage, he was not lucky in.
Oh, at least at the end of the first marriage, he
first-
wasn't. Yeah, and then his second marriage. Let's look at another passage about Laurel and see what you think of this, and maybe keep on with these. On page 991. Oh, is that right? No. Sorry, I got the wrong page. Page 916. It's the end of part 1 and part 2, the end of the first section. They've come back to Mount Salus. When Laurel was a child in this room, in this bed where she lay now, she closed her eyes like this, and the rhythmic nighttime sound of the two beloved reading voices came rising in turn up the stairs every night to reach her. She could hardly fall asleep. She tried to keep awake for pleasure. She cared for her own books, but she cared more for theirs, which meant their voices. In the lateness of the night, there were two voices reading to each other where she could hear them, never letting a silence divide or interrupt them, combined into one unceasing voice, and wrapped her around as she listened, as still as if she were asleep. She was sent to sleep under a velvety cloak of words, richly patterned and stitched with gold, straight out of a fairy tale, while they went reading on into her dreams. So here is Laurel back home. Her father has died. Both her parents are dead. She's come back with Faye bringing his body, and she sleeps in her own room at night and has these thoughts, these memories. What about these memories? What place does this have in the novel, do you think? Comments here? Yeah, Joe Ellen.
I'm taking a kind of flyer here, but the fairy tale could certainly be Sleeping Beauty.
Yeah.
And a kind of frozenness. Laurel doesn't hear her parents having sex as a child, but that's certainly something that she alludes to in the next paragraph. She says, Faye slept farther away tonight than in the hibiscus, where she could hear through the walls, and she didn't want to hear any cry or laugh coming from Faye, which I interpret as having someone else in there with her. Faye as being the kind of personage of sexual conduct, and her mother. I mean, I don't want to diminish a more positive reading of this, but feeling wrapped. But this section also suggests the kind of love that she grew up to know that was strictly protection and safety.
Yeah, I mean, it suggests something about the wonder and the closeness of her family, but it also is straight out of a fairy tale. It's a partial memory. It's a partial reconstruction of the past. And I like your reference to Sleeping Beauty, that, really this is part of being shut down. She's got this really positive memory of her parents reading to each other. It's like going to sleep under a velvety cloak of words, richly patterned and stitched with gold. It's straight out of a fairy tale. And in a way, there's a kind of self-awareness maybe there too, that this is a partial memory. So her memory of her father, her memory of her mother, they're partial, they're truncated. She's not facing them. What about on page, and then we go into the next section, page 952, in the garden with the roses. Talking about Becky's climber. I'd give a pretty to know what exactly that rose is, Laurel's mother would say every spring when it opened its first translucent flowers of the true rose color. It's an old one with an old fragrance and has every right to its own name, but nobody in Mount Salus is interested in giving it to me. All I had to do was uncover it and give it the room it asked for. Look at it. It's on its own roots, of course, utterly strong. That old root there may be 100 years old, or older, Judge McKelvey had said, giving her from the deck chair his saturnine smile. Strong as an old apple tree. Sienna bright leaves and thorns like spurts of match flame had pierced through the severely cut back trunk. If it didn't bloom this year, it would next. That's how gardeners must learn to look at it, her mother would say. Memory returned like spring, Laurel thought. Memory had the character of spring. In some cases, it was the old wood that did the blooming. Comments on this passage? Becky's climber. If it didn't bloom this year, it would next. That's how gardeners must learn to look at it. And memory returned like spring. Yeah, Mary.
I felt that was really interesting because I mean that is optimism and
Yeah.
the necessary optimism. You have to believe that it will come again, it will bloom again. So I thought that was really a beautiful connection to that sort of theme of optimism.
And that's how gardeners must look at it was added. It used to be that's how gardeners look at it, but it's how they must look at it. So it's a kind of willful optimism.
And I just to add on to that, I mean that's also the thing that blinds him is that climber, or that's what is assumed to be the thing that blinds him.
It is, yeah. That's where he realizes he's seeing behind him.
Yeah.
That flower. Yeah. Memory returned like spring. Sometimes it's the old wood that does the blooming. Well, she is gaining more access to her memory here as she digs in her mother's garden. And Becky's climber is going to bloom, but not yet. So the memories are still pretty partial here. All right. Last one. On page 972. Now memory is back. When someone lies sick and troubled for 5 years and is beloved, unforeseen partisanship can spring up among the well. During her mother's long trial in bed, Laurel, young and recently widowed, had somehow turned for a while against her father. He seemed so particularly helpless to do anything for his wife. He was not passionately enough grieved at the changes in her. He seemed to give the changes his same kind recognition, to accept them because they had to be only of the time being, even to love them, even to laugh sometimes at their absurdity. Why do you persist in letting them hurt me? Her mother would ask him. Laurel battled against them both, each for the other's sake. She loyally reproached her mother for yielding to the storms that began coming to her out of the darkness of vision. Her mother had only to recollect herself. As for her father, he apparently needed guidance in order to see the tragic. And then I'm going to skip over to page 975. That's when he started, of course, being what he scowlingly called an optimist. He might have dredged up the word out of his childhood. He loved his wife. Whatever she did that she couldn't help doing was all right. Whatever she was driven to say was all right. But it was not all right. Her trouble was that very desperation, and no one had the power to cause that except the one she desperately loved, who refused to consider that she was desperate. It was betrayal upon betrayal. So what about this dark night of the soul in the house and those memories? What do you see in those? Yeah, Teresa.
All right, this is what I saw, and I'd love to know what everybody thinks about it. I think that as you age, and Becky is clearly at a point where she's aging, she's fighting against the changes because she doesn't like them. They're at a cost, her vision, her health, and her husband, instead of fighting, accepts them. And maybe he accepts them too gracefully. and he doesn't stand up for her and advocate for her and join her in her fight. And maybe that's what the betrayal was, is that he didn't help her fight what was happening to her. What do you think? Did I read that?
What do y'all think? Rita?
That she said just what I was thinking, is that there's sort of a compliance that Judge McKelvey has, and an acceptance and maybe denial to a little bit, you could maybe say. And that would, I could see where Mrs. McKelvey would have that would bother someone when you're facing these kinds of catastrophic life changes and someone just says, oh, well, I agree with the last commenter.
Sarah? Welcome.
Can you hear me?
Yes, good.
Yeah. I think, Suzanne, when you line up these memories, one thing that occurs to me that I hadn't seen before is how Laurel is really stuck between her two parents, whether it is the really wonderful, beautiful image when she's a child and they're reading to each other, she becomes the thing in between them and she becomes the text that they're reading. But then the dark side of that is when her mother gets ill, she is between her two parents again, having to choose sides. And so I think, for better or worse, her memories are her trying to navigate how to be her mother's daughter and her father's daughter at the same time.
Yeah, I love that, Sarah. Beverly?
I think that what Becky is saying is she tried to save her father. She put him on a boat and took him to Baltimore at great risk to her own life, limb, health, everything else to be able to do that. Now, she was not able to, but she made the attempt. And unlike her, her efforts to save her father, I think she feels that nobody is going to that length to save her. Would there be anything that could be done? Probably not. But the difference in how she reacted when her father was so desperately ill and how they're reacting, which she views as more of an acceptance, I think is just totally unpalatable to her as a
Also, I
weakness,
think
in fact.
Yeah, the very fact that they are, in a way, the judge is not acknowledging how desperate she
Right.
feels.
Right.
This situation is intolerable. I am facing what I can't bear. And he's saying, well, I like to make it all right. I want to make it all right. He can't. And just to acknowledge her desperation would be an important step, I think. Yeah, Joellen.
And neither can Laurel address the
No.
desperation.
Yeah.
And she can't do anything either. But I'm interested in how Becky is looking at her past, and she looks at the wild strawberries, perhaps in a similar way that the judge looks at Becky's climber. And she uses it also to berate the minister, to put him down along with everybody else who perhaps aren't initiates into her past. But the judge, we've talked about using movement into the past to perhaps move toward dying. Maybe that's what Becky is doing here. No one can help her, but she remembers the wild strawberries and moments like that are not that she's returning to, but I mean, I think that's part of the mystery of dying, perhaps. And also, I noted that Becky's climber does not have a name. The places in West Virginia, Laurel notes, don't have names. It's the courthouse, it's the whatever, it's the whatever. And it sounds a little bit also, not like fairy tale exactly, but an essential place.
And we've talked about Becky trying to save her father and that heroic effort, but she blames herself that she's not present for her mother's death. That bell that her mother rings for help is only as good as the person being within the scope of its ring. And I wasn't there, and she cries bitterly, uncontrollably, in that sense that she has failed her own mother and Laurel's sense that she's failed her mother and her father, I think. Yeah, Harriet?
Yeah, I like that. I'm thinking about death and stages of separation, and the way in which Becky is. I mean, she's got a case to make. I think, I think that the idea that the judge is willing to love her as she's changed is very problematic from Becky's point of view. But I also see Becky separating from her family as she's heading into death. And I was thinking about something. I think Joellen was saying, that we're looking at the things that Laurel doesn't face. I'm thinking about how in her climactic moment with Faye, she tells a lie. She says, my mother never did hurt any living creature after Faye has called her mother crazy. And that's a lie. So even at the moment of her realization, she's struggling to accept what she knows about this final episode between her parents.
Well, John?
I just want to, I think, just leave it at asking a question about whether the memory passages are resolved, or at least for Becky. And that's in the next to last page of the book, where it says, memory lived not in initial possession, but in the freed hands, pardoned and freed, and in the heart that can empty but fill again, in the patterns restored by dreams. And for me, and this is just my reading, it seems to me that maybe I need to give a little background about where this is coming from, but from being an attorney and trying cases and interviewing witnesses about the same event, everybody at an intersection of a car wreck, everybody you would talk to would have a different version of what happened. And all of them were telling the truth. There is no question about that. They were telling you what they believed they saw and heard, but it was very, very, I should never say never, but it was very, very rarely that two people ever agreed about what they had just seen. And that used to be an old experiment that law professors in evidence would give at the first of a class, where they'd have somebody walk into the room and shoot somebody. And then the person who had, with a blank gun, of course, and then the person would leave, and then he would start asking people what they saw. And the outcome of the experiment was that, again, nobody could agree about the memory. And memories are very personal. They're very malleable. And to me, this passage, that sentence, is how Laurel has resolved her memories for herself about all these different people that have been a part of her life. And that and one thing I take from it, even after someone passes, that there is the opportunity to, we all have the opportunity to reassess the memory that we have about a person. And we may come to the conclusion, well, maybe I didn't give that person all that they were due when they were here on earth. And maybe I need to rethink, what I had to say or what I felt about those people, particularly family members.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if this is not part of the resolution to what Harriet is bringing. With Faye, Laurel does falsify the past, but ultimately she is going to let go of the hostility. She's going to leave the breadboard. She's not going to hit her with it. It's going to come down, and she's going to go knowing that the past is no more open to help or hurt than was father in his coffin. The past is like him, impervious and can never be awakened. It is memory that is the somnambulist. It will come back in its wounds from across the world like Phil, calling us by our names and demanding its rightful tears. It will never be impervious. The memory can be hurt time and again, but in that may lie its final mercy. As long as it's vulnerable to the living moment, it lives for us. And while it lives, and while we are able, we can give it up its due. So no longer trying to correct the other people's views of the past or her own, but trying to be as open to the past as she can be, and to have a memory that may be different over time. It may change over time. Her understanding of the past will change over time. So I think she thinks early in this section, life is nothing but the continuity of its love, the importance of memory. And the last thing she thinks in this section is, yes, even if memory hurts, even if it is painful, at least while we have that pain, we know it lives. And while it lives, we can give it up its due. You know, Harriet?
Sorry. You know, while you were charting memories in your look back at the book, I was taking that passage that John read, that moment of her finding that she can have memory living in freed hands. That she doesn't need connection with the house. She doesn't even need connection with this town or the specifics of her parents at this point, because she's been informed by something that she's taking away in her freed hands. What I did, instead of looking back at memory, was to look back at hands. And wow, I'm going to say that the list that I'm going to share is actually 4 times the length of this little list, which is too long as it is, but bear with me for a minute. So I'm just charting how she's prepared for this emphasis on this moment. Miss Adele's empty hands at the funeral, Mount Salas with Faye left on their hands by Clint. At the funeral, Faye striking out with her hands, Laurel finding the letters in her mother's hand, Faye's phantom nail polish hands on that heirloom desk, Laurel putting her hands over her hair to protect against the bird in the house, Faye repeatedly putting her hands to her hair to primp it. We see Laurel's holding her mother's notebooks in her hands. We see, we remember her grandmother's remark that the pigeons would eat from her hand if she would let them. The stone boat, she significantly passes from Clint's hand to Becky's when he makes it. Her mother is pictured with her hands full of wildflowers. Becky puts her hand out to the hospital orderly in exhilaration when he's taking her to surgery. Becky takes Clint's hands to help him bear it when she accuses him of failing her. Phil handcrafts the breadboard made with his good large hands. Laurel is considering having a hand at making her mother's bread. Laurel's hand ready to strike Faye. Laurel leaving the breadboard because she can live with freed hands. And the hands of the children, small and unknown at the end, in the last final lines that wish her goodbye, waving her on her way. But you know, I couldn't share all that I found, and they're all significant moments and odd moments that make you think, you know, like her taking Clint's hand, Becky taking Clint's hand when she accuses him, or the hand for the orderly, hospital orderly. And
of course her name.
Yes, and of course
Phil's name. Yeah.
So she's underlined it 1,000 times. Yeah.
I want to read you just at the end here what Reynolds Price says about this ending and about the freed hands. There is at the end, each time I've reached it, a complicated sense of joy, simple exhilaration in the courage and skill of the artist, quite separate from the tragic burden of the action. Joy that a piece of credible life has been displayed to us fully, and in the act fully explained. I take Laurel's understanding to be also the author's and ours. There can be no second meaning, no resorts to attempt to discredit Laurel's vision. And then perhaps most troubling and most appeasing, the sense that Laurel's final emotion is joy, that she is now an optimist of the sort her father never knew, if not as she drives away from her home, then tomorrow, back at work, that the onlooker's gifts have proved at last the strongest of human endowments, vision, distance, stamina, the courage of all three, that had been there any that had there been any ear to listen, Laurel would almost surely have laughed, abandoning her weapon, as Milton's God laughs at the ignorance and ruin of Satan. Only God has hearers, the Son and his angels. For Laurel has been both victim and judge, who goes beyond both into pure creation. Only she has discovered the pattern of their lives, her parents, Faye's, the Chisholms, her friends, her own, and then comprehension, which is always comic. All patterns are comic, snow crystal or galaxy in Andromeda or family history, because the universe is patterned, therefore ordered and ruled, therefore incapable of ultimate tragedy. Interim tragedy is comprised in the order, but cannot be the end. And if it should be universal pain, then that too is comic by definition to its onlooker. God's vision is comic, alpha and omega. So there is Reynolds Price saying the final emotion we feel here is joy. That there those hands twinkling brings us a sense of joy for Laurel, and that she's not trying to correct memories. She's accepting her situation, and her hands are freed. She doesn't have. Well, I'll let go. Rita, and then Teresa.
I just want to quickly comment that this was one of the few times where my schedule, because I usually work rotating shifts, so I always have to listen to this after the fact. And it's just want to say how wonderful this group is and how smart everyone is. I just love the comments, and we're always listening. I am always listening. So
it is a pleasure to talk with all of these folks. Yeah, Teresa.
I think that this book it really touched me pretty deeply, and I'm sure it did all of you as well. 2022 was a remarkably difficult year for me and my family, and this book really capsulized a lot of my thinking, and I just want to thank you. It really hit home on so many different levels, and I will leave it at that. It's been a real pleasure.
I think it's a book that gets better to me every time I read it. And part of the fact is that as I grow older, more and more of these experiences are similar to my own. And it brings me insight into those. So I'm very grateful for that. Next time we're going to start, and Jennifer, we're going to have it online, right? We're having trouble with getting a website, I think, that will protect the copyright. Is that the?
Well, yeah, we're getting scans. So next week we'll discuss sections 1 and 2 of the 1969 version that ran in the New Yorker. The scans will be provided via a temporary link in the Welty at Home email. We're hoping to get it to you by midweek, but we've had some losses at our MDAH department, and so we have to just get people moving on it and keep the project going. I also wanted to let you guys know that this Friday is the end for applications for the Welty Fellowship. So just if you guys know anybody who was interested in that, tell them to get in touch with us or Mississippi Department of Archives and History.
All right, so next time we're going to start over again with the Optimist Daughter, and we're going to read the first version of it. And Reynolds Price essay was written in response to the first version. Then when the book version came out, he wrote a little afterwards to his essay, comparing the two, but saying that passage I just read, he still agreed with that. So we might also talk about that when we come to talk about the New Yorker. So we're gonna look at the creative process here, how the story changed into a novel, why the changes, why you think the changes were made, what is the effect of the changes. We can also ask ourselves, was it wise to make those changes? Should she have kept it the way it was? So that will be another question as we look at it. So we'll start with the New Yorker next time, parts 1 and 2, and we'll be comparing them to the novel, to the 1972 novel. So the 1969 story, the 1972 novel. Anyone have a last word? Thank you all. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.